right, Saagar, what is on your radar?
Well, Senator Bernie Sanders stopped by the New York Times editorial board for nearly 90 minutes in what can really only be described as a doozy. The entire transcript of the interview, it's worth reading in full, if only so that you can get to the bottom so you can see that they accidentally identified Senator Nina Turner as Tina Turner. But I digress. The most interesting section of the Times interview was the sparring between Bernie Sanders and the Times editorial board on immigration. Ironically, Sanders shares the same view that people like Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, and I do, that illegal immigrant labor depresses the wages of American workers. For cultural reasons, he has adopted a de facto open border policy with his calls for zero enforcement, but that only becomes important later. See, even though Bernie literally believes in abolishing ICE and decriminalizing border crossings, he still has committed the unpardonable sin of believing in basic labor economics. Bernie told the Times, quote, "We have people who are being exploited. If you're undocumented and you're being paid $5 an hour, why am I going to pay her $12 an hour? That makes very intuitive sense, right?" Well, no. The New York Times' Benjamin Applebaum spat back at Bernie. They quote, "There's a lot of research suggesting that that's not actually the case." Then the Times went through and annotated Sanders' remarks with highly dubious fact checks pointing to cherry-picked studies which supposedly prove their point. In other words, Sanders committed a thought crime, which may lead one to conclude we mean to crack down on illegal immigrant labor in this country, and it doesn't even matter that he acknowledges this and has a differing solution, which is instead to legalize the entire population and end wage discrimination against Americans by giving all workers a $15 per hour minimum wage. The Times annotations and the blistering question of the Vermont senator shows their total commitment to neoliberal economic theory and why their position as one of the commanding heights of American culture is so damaging to American workers. What they demand from Sanders is total fealty to the idea that the more GDP goes up, the better off the lives of all aggregate Americans. This is a small window into how the New York Times controls the narrative. They interview candidates and then publish highly dubious fact checks right next to their statements. You don't have any recourse to correct them. They get to ask the questions, and now they even get to write the answers. And if you think that they're limited just to this section on immigration, which I happen to really care about, you'd be wrong. At one point in the interview, they challenged Bernie Sanders as to why he's bad at bipartisan deal-making. When he countered he had passed more amendments than anyone else in a Republican-controlled Senate, the Times annotation said, quote, "This is not necessarily evidence of working across the aisle to sponsor legislation." Yes, you heard that right. Why do I even care about this? Because it is how the New York Times and the Washington Post fact-checker have stacked the deck against conservatives for years. They write the narrative, perpetuate the narrative, and will will that narrative into reality. They keep down and slime anyone who does not agree with them through their control of the most powerful media organizations in America. And it's funny, Crystal, because I was just reading Elizabeth Warren's interview with the New York Times, and she says the exact same thing that Bernie does. She's like, yeah, I think a lot of people are being exploited, and I mean, look, we disagree on the enforcement mechanism and all that, but what her and Bernie say is it's basic labor economics. If you can pay somebody less money, then you're not going to pay somebody more money legally. It's unbundling all of the things of employer-employee relationship and paying somebody illegally to do it. They say, let's legalize everybody, pay everybody a minimum wage. Okay, we can disagree on that. But the Times, it includes a paragraph-long fact check saying that no, that's not the case, because they have seen that immigration increases GDP for all, which means that while it might hurt some workers, it would hurt more workers in order to decrease it. So again, they buy into, how are they supposed to, these are the same people who understand this on the Trump tax bill, but for some reason it goes out the window whenever we start talking about immigration. Yeah, and that's what really bothers me.
The best way to understand, and what's so frustrating here is, like, look, you and I are very upfront about the lenses we view politics through, about the ideology we're coming at this with. We're upfront about that. People know what they're getting. They know the perspective that we bring to the table. But the Times and the Post and these supposedly neutral outlets pretend to be just calling balls and strikes when they have an ideology too.
Yes.
They have an ideology of neoliberalism That's what they back. That's what they support. That's what they want their audience to support as well. And most of their audience does support that. So when you read these things, you just have to understand that they are ideological actors. In many ways, they're even more ideological than, than clearly partisan outlets. Like if we did that thing of doing an interview with Bernie or with Biden and then coming in and fact checking and trying to make it as negative as possible, we would rightly be roasted because it's just completely unfair.
Who do you think you are? You think that you have determined, one of the most contentious areas of labor economics, and you can distill it into like a small paragraph? And that's why I wanted to also point out that what Ryan Grimm showed is that this is a BS. They're just like, oh, it doesn't necessarily show, bipartisan deal making. Excuse me, the man passed more amendments. He's known as, quote, the amendment king under the Bush administration for his ability to craft across the aisle legislation.
He worked on veterans issues. He works with moderate Democrats on prescription drug pricing. I mean, and not to mention that it also, and this is again the ideology, it assumes a certain type of change.
Right.
It's the Joe Biden, I'm going to go and Mitch McConnell's going to come and sit down at the table with me and we're going to work things out. It assumes that that is the right and only way to do politics, whereas Sanders, AOC, et cetera, have a very different theory of the case. Yeah. Look, they've worked through those channels as well, and they know how to do that. But their response is much more about the outside pressure campaign and forcing legislators to do things that they don't want to do. And so, again, it's ideological to assume that those metrics are the only ones that matter. On the other hand, this interview was actually hilarious.
Oh, it was funny.
If you read the whole thing, it's really funny.
It's very contentious.
It's very contentious. Yeah. And, I know that Bernie doesn't like to go. He has total contempt for that. Like, it's just utterly clear. He has complete contempt for them. They ask him dumb stuff like
if he ever has heartbroken,
and if he has an Amazon Prime account, and what are the apps on his phone. I mean, it's really
my favorite.
The way he responds is
my favorite was this. Senator Sanders, in a time in which fascism might be coming to America because President Trump does rallies, you say you're also going to do rallies as president. Do you worry about Senator
Sanders? Just like Trump? It's like, what? What are you talking about?
It's unbelievable.
What was his quote? He said, I don't tolerate bullshit particularly well.
That's what he said.
But what I was going to say, though, is I think he should do more of these because it's actually, I know people slam him for being the grumpy old man or whatever. That's actually my favorite Bernie is the cantankerous, just not having any of it. That's my favorite Bernie.
This is what drives me crazy. And this is, like I said, I'm drawing a thread to this because they do this on everything, is that they literally get to ask questions and write the answers. Everything has to fit through their framework. And if you don't do that, you will be punished for your thought crime.
Indeed.
There we go.
Next up on Rising, American Conservative Magazine editor Jim Antle is going to share his thoughts on the latest about Iran. That's next.